good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Hele. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar. My name is Aisel Kipruto. I'm the head of communications at ESSA, and I'm based in Nairobi. We are really happy to have you joining from across the globe. So before we proceed, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the recent USAID funding suspension. I know it's a difficult period for all of us. We all know the impact of that decision, and our thoughts are with all those affected during this challenging time. Again, I just want to make some few housekeeping items to ensure that we all have a smooth experience. So first, the session is being recorded and we will share with you after this event. So by participating, you consent to being recorded. If you have any concerns about that, please let us know in the chat section. Questions, please use the Q&A feature in this webinar or raise your hand and we will address the questions during the Q&A session. Feel free to introduce yourself. We would love to know where you are joining from, your name, your country, and all that. So please use the chat to do the introduction. If you have any technical issue, please put that on chat. My colleague Brilliant will be able to support you in case you have any challenge. So this event will be running for 1.5 hours and we hope we'll have a fruitful conversation. So I want to just talk about really the focus today, why we are here. And really, again, thank you for joining us. I can see we have 101 people so far. There was a lot of interest. I think we had over 650 people expressing their interest to join this event. So many thanks for that. So today we are here to launch the 8 interventions for enhancing education research in Africa. So these are a set of actionable proposals designed to improve the education research ecosystem in Africa. So over the last 18 months, we've been working with all of you. We've worked with policymakers. We've worked with like-minded partners to develop these interventions. We went to many conferences and events to just do consultations and really listen to voices of African education researchers. What is it that they need or we need to do to improve the research ecosystem? And so today we are really happy to share these interventions and discuss what is it that we need to do to take this intervention to the next level. This event is brought to you by Education Sub-Saharan Africa, ESSA, and Southern Hemisphere with support from Echidna Giving, Imaginable Futures, and Jacobs Foundation. I just want to briefly introduce ESSA and Southern Hemisphere who've been implementing these projects. So ESSA improves education outcomes through research, advocacy, and program design using evidence and data from Africa. We work in partnership with local researchers, higher education stakeholders, policymakers, and others to address challenges and co-design solutions to better education outcomes. For more information, you can check our website. May I request my colleague Ni to post the link to ESSA website on chat. Southern Hemisphere, whom we've been working with, is women-owned socio-economic development consultancy with the single-minded focus of creating meaningful social change. So again, for more about Southern Hemisphere, please check their website. Ni, you can post the link to the website. So today we are really delighted to have 3 distinguished panelists who will expound to us on what we need to action those interventions. So first, I'll just talk about, I'll just introduce them briefly. We have Dr. Lucy Wakiaga, who works for the African Population and Health Research Center. We have Ms. Emis Njeru from the Ministry of Education, Kenya. And we have Professor Richardson Adai from University of Education, Winneba in Ghana. So they will be able to share their insights on how to make these interventions a reality, and also the kind of partnerships that we require to actualize them. We also have Dr. Lucy Eddy, who will be moderating the panel session. We have Krista, who will be moderating the Q&A session. We have Dana, who will be making the presentation. And we have Modupe from Brookings Institute, who will be doing the closing remarks. So really, we are happy and we encourage you to actively engage with us throughout the session. And yeah, many thanks for joining us. So before we move to the presentation of the 8th intervention, we just want to share with you a video to talk about or to showcase what the EERA project is all about. So without much ado, let's roll the video.
So it is a research project where we are trying to identify what it will take to build a robust and sustainable field of education research on the continent.
It has been created by Southern Hemisphere and ESSA together with funding from the Jacobs Foundation, Echidna Giving and Imaginable Futures. And it emerged out of the Education Forum for Africa, which gave a directive to identify African-led solutions to enhance education research in Africa.
If you are an education researcher based in Africa and working on research or education research in Africa, you need to care about ERA and even join our meeting, participate in our online event, because your voice needs to be heard. People need to know about your specific challenges, your specific needs, and what is your own dream for the field of education research at your local, or country level. So if you are researchers, if you are an education researcher, you need to reach out and express, your situation or share your perspective. Even
Ellie, I think the video stopped. If you can
System
share that.
for education research globally should be interested in this project because it is going to ensure that indigenous knowledge, African-informed research is going to be available to use to improve research in Africa, but not only in Africa, everywhere in the world.
Great. Thank you so much, Ni and Ellie, for the video. So we want to move to the next stage where my colleague Dana Lomoskai from Southern Hemisphere will take us through the 8 interventions. Welcome, Dana. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today. After listening to myself on a video, I'm feeling quite self-conscious. But I'd just love to hear from all of you. If you've been involved in one of the ERA consultation sessions, if you've come to one of our virtual meetings, or you were at one of our conference events over the last 18 months, please put your hand up in the reactions button, show us if you've been involved. If this is your first time that you're participating in an ERA event, give us I don't know if you can give us a reaction in this forum, but let us know if you've been involved. Raise your hand. Let us know if you've been involved. I think you can, or put it in the Q&A. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. I need to get permissions to share my screen. Sorry. So go. As you know, as Isel mentioned, the ERA process has been going over 18 months. And really what we're arguing is that the time is now for investing in education research in Africa. The interventions that we have developed are very much rooted in a participatory process that involved over 200 African education researchers. And the solutions that we're proposing are very much based on a systems approach. So everyone will work to supporting the other one, focusing on long-term impact and addressing key challenges that I'm sure you're all very familiar with. The interventions are interconnected and should be considered to be part of a whole comprehensive interconnected strategy. So even though, you know, an organization might want to start with one, it would be better to think how we could work together. We know that I don't need to convince the people who have joined this webinar why this is an important issue, but just to remind us that Africa is home to the world's youngest population, with significant youth dividend poised to shape the future global workforce. And education, of course, plays a vital role in this, and empowering African researchers is not just about fairness. It's about effectiveness and impact, making sure that education that people receive is the best that they can get, and in ensuring that everyone can reach their full potential. And also, what we're hoping is that through these interventions, we will be able to facilitate more south to south, as well as south to north global learning, rather than northern driven initiatives. So through the situation analysis that we did, we uncovered that education research faces many systemic challenges, including fragmentation, underfunding, and an over-reliance on international donors. And historically, education research in Africa has been driven by institutions in the global north, which often prioritize their own agendas rather than local needs. So through the systemic situation analysis research, which you can find on the EERA website, the priorities and agendas of African researchers have surfaced through the consultation process, and we had lots of conversations across the continent with people. Here's a photograph of where we attended the EE4A conference in Kenya last year, where we shared the ideas for the interventions, the results of the situation analysis, and we asked deans of education in Kenya to imagine what a future might look like when the changes that they wanted to bring about in the education sector were here. And they suggested what the outcome should be. And this formed very much a part of our thinking at the beginning of this year, when we had a theory of change workshop with our steering committee made up of esteemed members of the African education research community, also at the beginning of this year. And there you will see members of the EERA team, as well as the executive committee, steering committee, developing a theory of change for what the education research system could look like in Africa. And from this, we developed this theory of change, as I said, these 8 interacting interventions. And what I'd like to do today is to present some of these to you. I don't know if we're going to get through all of them, but I'll try at least give you an overview of each of them, and then we can maybe go into more detail later if you have particular questions. But essentially, what we're talking about, these were the areas that we identified that mattered through our consultations and our process, that mattered the most in terms of changing and strengthening the field of education research in Africa. And the first was ensuring that there's local funding over time, that funding is locally driven to drive local research agendas. That that this is also supporting collaborative research, either nationally or regionally or across the continent, collaborative research projects, which are driven by local research agendas, African-oriented research agendas. And if these three, if there's local funding and local research agendas and collaboration, there's going to be a lot of knowledge emerging from Africa. And in order to produce this knowledge, we're going to need to have, we're proposing a set of research chairs based at higher education institutions or even in think tanks that could drive education research, that would be supported by strong grant administration in the institutions, as well as trained and strengthened researchers from all levels. And then they will need to share this research communication. So we're also proposing research communication platform that ensures that education research is reaching whoever needs it, including African education researchers, without paywalls and without pay to publish, in many different languages, using AI to talk about how to get it to people in their local languages, as well as training and knowledge exchange, so training for research communications and platforms for sharing and exchanging knowledge. So that's an overview. And I will go very briefly into each of the different areas. Please put your questions into the Q&A. We're using the Q&A for questions, so please put your questions in the Q&A and we will try to address them throughout the process. So the first and key issue is to develop African-led education research agendas. And the idea is to support the development of African education research agendas that are rooted in African policy priorities and local development goals. And this must be led by African education researchers and policymakers. And it's fundamental to ensure that research projects are designed to address critical gaps in existing knowledge and shed light on real problems being experienced in practice. So the assumption in our theory, and which I am sure will be proven, is that locally driven research agendas will really address the priorities of African education research and African students better than agendas that are driven by them. For this, research agendas will need appropriate structures to design, facilitate, and champion the African research agenda. So we need to think about, what do those look like? What are the appropriate structures? What do they look like? Who's going to develop research agendas? Is it deans of education forums? Are they going to emerge from conferences? So we need to support conferences and networking. Where do agendas form and how they form? Those are the institutions that will need support, right? Developing research agendas will need participation, transparency, and accountability, because we need to make sure that the agendas are rooted on the ground, and including considerations of gender equity and social inclusion, and also ensuring positionality of early career researchers informing these agendas, that their interests and needs are responded to. One of the things we can do to support African research agendas is to map the evidence and to respond to the needs, to find out, where do we have gaps? A lot of information. Where do we have gaps? And to support the development of agendas to strengthen those areas. And of course, it will also need lots of communications and advocacy and sharing of information across the sector, so that we can, people who support particular agendas can share their vision and get more support for those research agendas and funding. The second key issue that I want to share is around catalyzing African funding for education research. And this is really about diversifying funding sources for education research by crowding in funding from African governments, from African philanthropies, the private sector, and other local stakeholders. The assumption here again is that the more that we can ensure local funding, this will then again drive local agendas, and local agendas will meet real needs, and these real needs will solve real problems and provide solutions that are grounded in African realities. So that is very much the argument for African funding. It's a long-term process. Obviously, we've got this long-term vision for strengthening the education field, but ultimately what we want to do is reduce dependency on international donors. So that is, and to do this, we will need to create a variety of funding mechanisms linked to African education priorities and buy-in from policymakers. So different funding mechanisms, we could talk about different ways to ensure that money is flowing into Africa, that also encourages Africans to match funding, to create avenues for local funding, but also to ensure that the money is managed, even if the money is coming from the north, that it's managed locally by African entities. So no international intermediaries, that money will come directly to your institutions or through your National Research Foundation, and local entities will be managing the funding, which could be pooled from different sources and then shared out locally. And we're also advocating for core funding, that organizations have institutional stability, not just project funding. One of the key ways to get government to buy into funding research is to ensure that there are strong national research frameworks, science and technology policy frameworks, or what they're called many different things in different countries. But the stronger the policy framework, the more chance that government will adhere their commitments to funding. So that becomes a key part of it. And of course, we're advocating certain set of principles that will guide funding, that it must be African-led, long-term, flexible, and so on, that will encourage growth in the African funding, local funding of African research. And we want to ensure that funding also prioritizes access to funding for women, other marginalized groups, and early career researchers. This is not a new idea, but we didn't find any particular research chairs, if you know, in Africa that are focused on education. If you know of any, please let us know. There are examples of research chairs across the continent that are focusing on other fields, but we would like to promote research chairs or a network of research chairs across Africa that are funded academic positions that support academic institutions to advance research. And a chair isn't just one person. A chair is a team of people. So you've got a research chair that involves having senior academics supported by perhaps people doing fellowships, mentorships, post-PhDs and postdocs. So a research chair creates like a center or a hub around the chair, and the chair would also take responsibility for capacity strengthening, mentorship, and institutional leadership in the field. And this will need, as we said, teams of people around the research chair to support the research process. We'll need to, recruit and select researchers who would be interested in hosting, or institutions interested in hosting research chairs. We would need to have formalized responsibilities that the chair will be responsible for. And of course, we're always integrating gender and equity and social inclusion into this, so the roles and responsibilities must show that we are supporting women as well as early career researchers in these processes. And this is very much linked to intervention 4, which is in strengthening grant capacity, because we want to make sure that that whoever is managing the research chair also has the capacity to manage that grant. Okay, just checking how much time I have left. Seem to be on track. And then we also want to ensure that we can strengthen administrative, as I mentioned, administrative research capacities for those who are receiving research chairs for institutions. And that can, again, it can be within a country. We haven't prescribed what it could be, what it could look like. The idea is to stimulate thinking in this direction, so that it could be a network of institutions in one country with more advanced and less advanced institutions that could work together. Research chairs could spread across countries. It could be different funders may want to fund different research chairs focusing on different aspects. One could be early childhood development. Another one could focus on primary education, or it could be a very specific theme like human rights in education. So what we're talking about is avenues and wide interventions that you will give a framework for researchers to talk to education funders and say, this is what we need. It's located in this framework. It's positioned in this area of change. And we would like to start working with that with you. Yes, as I mentioned, this could be, again, a network model or an individual institutional model. But the idea is that we want to equip institutions to work with governments, to work with funders, and to have the capacity to manage research and research grants. The next is intervention is around training and professional development for education researchers. So again, this is very closely linked to the research chairs, the research grants, and the research professional development. Here we're talking about establishing funds to train and provide professional development of African researchers in the field of African research, with a particular focus on early career researchers. And this could be a wide variety of training of skills, holistic skills that African education researchers need to do their jobs properly, which is ranging from research skills to grant writing skills to network and to communication skills, and also to participation in conferences and networking opportunities so that you may strengthen the field and that you may go to the places where the conversations are happening, whether that be in Africa, whether that be internationally. And you're bringing your ideas into those spaces. And what this will need is a program for training and skills development in research and related skills. It will need a multifaceted approach. There isn't one way to do this. It could be short courses, it could be supported fellowships and postdocs, it could be longer term programs. So there isn't one way to do this, but the idea is that money will go towards training and professional development in different aspects. Again, it could be a single institution or a network. Definitely needs flexible funding options so that, as needs emerge, funded researchers are able to access funding as they need it. And they need exposure to collaborative opportunities, and it will also need tailored mentorship programs. I mentioned earlier the need for collaborative research projects. I know that collaboration can be complicated and messy. These don't need to be massive projects. In fact, what we're saying is start small, try to encourage participatory action research, because we heard a lot of people saying, for us to do kind of long-term randomized control trials or very positivist type research isn't feasible and isn't necessary. What we really want to be doing is working with communities, working in our education training colleges to develop processes and services and product and education technologies that are very useful right away. And so participatory action research came out very strongly, and we're suggesting that should be an orientation, not the only one, of these collaborative research projects that involve multiple organizations or institutions coming together for a shared interest or topic. And then just to run through the last two, which are very much related, it's about making sure that all the education research that is happening is shared, but also that researchers have access to it, to information. So we're talking about not necessarily one communications platform, but supporting communications platforms to make sure that education research is available, is accessible, and also making sure that African education researchers are equipped with the skills to communicate research to policy, to communicate research to each other in ways that, and to diverse audiences back to communities in ways that maximize research impact. And this will require education capacity strengthening in research communications, community engagement, like participatory action research, knowledge exchanges, support for the existing networks. We know that there are many existing networks that need funding. We know that there are conferences that are looking for money. So we want to support those and promote those, and also, of course, include women and early career researchers and other marginalized groups to promote themes relevant to gender equity and social inclusion. So those are the 8 interventions, and we'd like to just hear from you. We're going to launch a poll now. Which of these 8 interventions excite you the most? I wonder if the poll has been set up based on these questions. There we go. So based on these, so which of these is it? African funding? Is it creating an African education research agenda? Is it research chairs? Is it capacity strengthening for grant administration? Training of researchers in research skills and other grant-making skills, collaborative research projects, research communications platforms, or training in research communications and knowledge exchange? Which of these interventions excite you the most? Which of these areas excite you the most? And the second question we have is, what should the starting point be? Which intervention should be the starting point? So you can go into your, on your side and select which ones excite you the most for question 1, and which one should be the starting point. We know that they're all connected, but where would you start if this were you? Where would you start? Well, this is you. If you had all the power, or if you went up tomorrow and you said, I'm going to start raising funding for this, where would you start? It's going to have 2 minutes for this poll. Looking forward to seeing the results. Very curious. Let us know if you think there's any gaps in the question and answer. Love to hear your questions and your thoughts and ideas. Great. Here's the results of the poll. So African funding excites people the most, followed by creating an African education research agenda, collaborative research projects, training of researchers, research chairs, research communications and knowledge exchange, and capacity strengthening for grant administration. Great. And where would you start? You would start by creating an African education research agenda. Fantastic. And followed by then funding to fund this agenda, and then training of researchers. Interesting, interesting, interesting. So it's interesting that the starting points are not necessarily the same as the ones which are most exciting to you. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. And I'm going to hand over back to my colleagues.
Thank you so much, Dina, for that presentation. And it is now my great pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. Oh, I realised from the script, first I should introduce myself. My name is Lucy Heady. I'm the CEO of ESSA, and I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Lucy Wakiaga, Ms. Emes Najeru, and Dr. Richardson Ademanunkum. Lucy, Emes, and Richardson, if you could put on your cameras and I will introduce you properly. So first of all, I would like to introduce my namesake, Dr. Lucy Wakiaga. She is an associate research scientist at the African Population and Health Research Centre. Her research work and interests are in higher education research, leadership and gender, women in educational leadership, school leadership and teacher training. She holds a Doctor of Education from Howard University, and she currently leads a project on pedagogy, STEM and gender in higher education. And she is also the lead for the Gender Working Group at APHRC. Previously, before APHRC, Dr. Wakiaga served as a senior lecturer and director of quality assurance. She's passionate about research that empowers educational leaders and educators to foster transformative learning. In 2022, she was recognised for her collaborative book project, Women's Contribution to Higher Education and Social Transformation, Implications for Policy and Praxis in Kenya. Sticking in Kenya, I'm delighted to welcome Ms. Emes Najeru. Ms. Emes is the Director of Early Childhood Education at Kenya's Ministry of Education. She oversees policies and programs to enhance early learning outcomes. She holds a bachelor's degree in education and a master's in education administration and planning. Previously, she served as Deputy CEO of the National Council for Nomadic Education, advocating for inclusive education for marginalised communities. Ms. Njero has spearheaded initiatives to improve teacher training, curriculum development, and parental engagement in early childhood education. She's partnered with international organisations to implement best practices in early learning. Her dedication to building foundational skills in young learners has made her a key figure in Kenya's education sector and a respected voice in global early childhood development. And I'll move now from Kenya to the other side of the continent to welcome Dr. Richardson Adomanukum from Ghana. He is an Associate Professor of Curriculum and Pedagogy at the University of Education in Winneba. He holds a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and is an African Humanities Program postdoctoral fellow and a 2023 Carnegie Corporation of New York fellow. With an extensive experience as a teacher, researcher, and curriculum consultant in Ghana, the USA, and Malawi, Prof. Richardson actively contributes to educational reforms in Ghana, and he's authored numerous publications, including a recent monograph on religious education in Africa. He is a recipient of multiple awards and a member of several professional associations and serves as a reviewer and external examiner for universities across the continent. We are really privileged to have such an esteemed panel with us today, and I think you will have some great insights to help us think about how can we make these 8 interventions that Dina presented here, how can we make those a reality? And that is the question I'm going to start with. And I'm going to go first to my namesake, Dr. Lucy, and ask you this question. What is it going to take to make these ideas a reality?
Thank you so much, Lucy, and to the panelists, my fellow panelists, and to Dana for such a very comprehensive presentation of the interventions. So what is going to, just to respond to your question of what is going to make these interventions a reality, when I think of it, it's not a one size fits all. And I think having this conversation here today is a first step in terms of making these interventions a reality, because when you look at each of them, it cannot be accomplished. Any intervention cannot be accomplished by the constituents who are indicated there as the stakeholders. It requires the intervention, or a total intervention from all the stakeholders across the 8 areas of intervention. But I think more importantly, also thinking about goodwill. It's not so much making sure that all the stakeholders across the 8 interventions are included on the table, but more importantly, are their voices being heard? And besides their voices being heard, is there someone who is articulating what they are really trying to express, and then taking it a step further in terms of actualizing their interests, their voices, really giving them agency. So whether it is the policy makers, make sure that they are at the table. We know that we cannot move the needle if we don't have, for example, support of the government. And we see Emmys here coming from the Ministry of Education, because it's very important to have them on board in terms of policy formulation and also the implementation. And then having the role of other stakeholders, the higher education, public-private partnerships with industry, with corporate, going all the way to research institutions, for example, like APHRC, having us on the table. And then really remembering who is the key constituent in this whole conversation that we are having, which is the learner. If it's not the learner, then what are we talking about higher education? They are our They are our biggest and most important constituent. And then we have the educators, of course, and really building their capacity, because they are the ones who then impact the learning outcomes. And I think when Dana was making a presentation, she mentioned something about the youth dividend in Africa. And we know that it's very important for development of Africa to properly harness this youth dividend. And if we are to properly harness the youth dividend, then it is important and imperative that we strengthen the capacity of the educators. And so if we are to do that, then we need a very clear, effective, efficient structural system within higher education institutions. And that universities or higher education institutions cannot do that by themselves. So this is why we are talking about the other constituents, whether it's the Ministry of Education, public-private partnerships, and so on. So for me, we normally talk of a three-legged stool in the African culture, and we can put all these constituents into kind of three buckets to kind of, or the three legs to kind of hold the stool together. And we can then realize this vision of making sure that our research endeavors in Africa are relevant and that they are making impact in Africa and really serving the African vision in terms of its socio-economic and cultural development. Back to you, Lucy. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Lucy. And maybe to stick with the academic perspective for now, over to you, Prof. Richardson. Tell me, what do you think is going to make these interventions a reality?
Thank you very much, Lucy, and good afternoon to my co-panelists and to the audience. I see a number of people participating, and I'm excited that they got involved at some point with the poll. And I want to commend ESSA and EERA for bringing this up. I've been in a lot of conversations, and usually it's about complaining about what is not working, and we end up not proposing any solution. But this time we have ideas of how we can move forward down, and then we get to talk about it. And I think it's a very positive step. And I do agree with Lucy that is the first step, like appreciating that there's something on the table for us to begin having conversations about and then acting upon them. I think it's a great step. And so I want to thank you for bringing this up. What will make this work? First, I think I totally support the systems approach that is being proposed with these 8 thematic areas. I was interested in the results of the polls, and very interested because I think a lot of people don't think the way I'm thinking. Initially, I wanted to vote in the poll, but I couldn't. I noticed that we have a voice to say what we want about the poll. But interestingly, my key interest out of the 8 is the researcher. And I believe that's where we need to start from. And this is my reason. Interestingly, 6% of us here support me. I hope when I'm done, I will get a lot more people changing their minds and following me. The bigger challenge we have in our sub-region with research, apart from funding, of course, has been how to synthesize our research and create a common research agenda. Because in a lot of instances, the challenges in Ghana are similar to that of Nigeria and Kenya and Tanzania and South Africa. And everybody is doing their own thing, but there's no coordination. And so we end up replicating and duplicating instead of maximizing use of scarce resource. So if we're going to start a research share in identifiable institutions across the continent, in my mind, I am looking at a network of research chairs in all these universities, forming a network of a collaborative team that will be first starting local agenda. So the agenda in Winneba might be different from the agenda in Cape Coast, although we are all in Ghana. From that point, we can harness the local agenda, put them together, synthesize and create a national agenda. Then we can scale up the national agenda to create a sub-regional agenda and then possibly a regional agenda as a block. So that satisfies one of the legs of the solutions that are on the table, which is about setting agenda. We can start it from the bottom up and then eventually get there. It also solves the problem of funding. So the researchers will solicit local funding, try to see if there are opportunities to do international or state funding, and then come together to get one big funding pool where we could source for some projects and activities within the framework for what we want to do. The researcher can support the establishment of local administrative setups in the various universities that will support research. They will also be able to support local training and also support international training, because there's the idea of having research fellowship, internship, mentorships. If we have this chair, which I was happy about the explanation, that is not just one person, but setting up like a team of people at each university doing that, then we could be moving around, cross-fertilizing our idea, having some young researchers in Ghana move to Nigeria, having some young researchers from Nigeria move to Tanzania on fellowships, short stays, try to work on research projects and cross-fertilize ideas. And the researchers can actually do this. When it comes to dissemination, we can disseminate because we're already cross-fertilizing our ideas. We are collaborating on research. And so it becomes very easy to disseminate beyond our national borders. And for collaborative funding, works fantastic. If we have a network of chairs that are connected, then coming together to pursue research agenda collaboratively becomes so easy. And so I believe the starting point should be having a research chair. But I think it's not as simple as just, oh, let's do a research chair. Because one challenge I foresee is who sits on the chair. And if we are not able to set up the real structures that will make it work, we could do it and not work. But if we give a thought to it and put up the right structures in place, I like the part of the presentation that explained that we'll put clear benchmarks there, expectations, requirements, and all those things, coupled with some funding, which I believe will be a bait to all these universities. Once there's funding, everybody will be interested. Say, okay, set a research, these are the requirements, and then these are the expectations. Once we are able to get that set up, then all the other things will fall in place. And so that's my thought about how we can move this forward.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. That's really insightful, and of that idea about the networks. Now, let's go back to Kenya and hear the perspective from the policymaker. Madame Emis, can you tell us from your perspective what is needed to make these interventions a reality?
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, my colleagues, panelists. I just want us to ask ourselves, what does Africa have? Does it have anything? How can we make it better what we have? And how can we embrace new ideas? I'll base my response to that because Africa has been undertaking research over years. But now, how can we access that research? How can we make it better? How can we embrace new ideas? And I appreciate ESSA for bringing this out because we can do things better, we can coordinate better, we can train our people, we can use technology and all that to make research evidence credible. And I'll start by saying we need to spark in greater synthesis and the use of available evidence to inform policy and action. Many African countries seek evidence from developed countries while ignoring what is available in Africa. For example, universities have huge volumes of unutilized research findings. How can we encourage these universities or encourage policymakers and program managers to use and cite local research to encourage more researchers to undertake research. So my point here is Africa as evidence. How can we synthesize this evidence to make it available for policymakers and program managers? 2, we need also to increase funding. Governments should have a dedicated budget for research, and this one is possible because like in Kenya, it's a mandate of the ministry to undertake research, but there's no dedicated budget. It's the high time African countries, through various advocacy forums like the one we have today, to encourage governments to have a dedicated budget besides seeking funding from other sectors. And also I want us to also mention, we can do it better by strengthening research institutions. For example, in Kenya, I want to confess that we have institutions which are undertaking research in education and other areas. We have KIPLA, the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis. We have SEMASTIA, which is Center for Mathematics, Science and Technology. We have Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, among others. How can we capacity build these institutions? What is lacking? Why are we not getting evidence from these institutions? Are they lacking capacity? And therefore, funding is critical so that we can equip these institutions with better skills, with knowledge and understanding, and the new ideas that other countries are using to have credible data. I also mentioned on improving access to journals and resources, because at the start I said Africa has evidence, but are we able as policymakers able to access? And I'm saying researchers in Africa often face barriers to access scientific journals and resources. I am being included because I'm a policymaker. It's very hard to access these journals to get evidence for policy formulation and reviews. Creating, therefore, open access platforms and ensuring affordability of research materials can help democratize knowledge. And another thing is government policy support. Our government must create conducive environment by establishing favorable policies, offering tax incentives for research-related businesses, and creating frameworks that promote innovation. And I also say there is need to ensure that female researchers and other educators, and I would prefer we say gender. Let us have equal gender in provision of research, because if we only talk about females, yes, we'll discriminate the boy child. And in my country now, we are emphasizing on both gender, because we have also realized when we leave the boy child out there, they are being disadvantaged. And mostly we need to also to consider the marginalized communities and the vulnerable societies like in the informal settlements, so that research can address their plight. There are various gaps in these areas, but in most cases, we don't carry research in these areas. And let us leverage on technology. There are various ways of carrying out research in Africa and compare and benchmark with other parts of Africa, other countries, and share information and compare notes and help each country to know what is happening in Uganda, what is happening in Tanzania and other parts of of African countries. By so doing, we will use research to benefit our nations and improve the education sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ennis. You gave us such a tour of all of the different potential avenues that this could go down. I might stick with you for a moment. This is going to be a rapid fire question because I've just been told we don't have so long left for my questions and we want to open it up to questions from the audience. But one of the things that really struck us during the 18 months of the ERA consultation process was how much was already happening. So much work already happening in terms of new networks, new ideas to improve the education research community, but that these needed kind of more resource or better connectivity to be catalysed. And I want to ask you, Ms. Emmis, what have you seen any concrete things happening that you think match with some of these 8 interventions that you'd like to highlight here today?
Yes, I've seen things happening in Africa for the first time. We have been involved in research processes. We have been involved in co-creation of the processes, especially by ESSA. And we are seeing Africa now coming to life as far as sharing information is concerned about evidence, and also emphasizing on African context research, because that is what we lack.
Thank you so much. And I might ask the same question to your fellow countrywoman, Dr. Lucy. Are there particular things happening now in Kenya, or maybe broadly in the region that you're familiar with, that you would like to highlight now that you think are contributing actively to a more vibrant education research field in Africa?
Thank you, Lucy. And I would second what Emmis has just said in terms of the work that ESSA is doing, really highlighting a lot in terms of just making us refocus our attention to higher education research. And then, of course, I will not forget to mention the CATA project that is in APHRC, and the work they are doing with postgraduate students. But then also not to forget the role of development partners, and like for instance, Echidna, and the work they are doing in terms of when they provide the resource support, pushing it more towards institutional capacity, what is called the co-funding. So the administrative team, the research team, just making sure that their capacities are strengthened. And when you look also at their efforts of some of the funders now being more African focused, and really trying to push the African agenda. And I'm sure someone will poke holes into that, because I just glimpsed at the Q&A and someone said, what is Africa? How do we define Africa? But I think these are good moves in the right direction. And very quickly, I know we don't have time, I would also want to bring to the attention the role of industry and corporate, seeing them putting resources in institutions. One example is like Manu Chandaria, and he was able to put up in partnership with Microsoft, putting something at Strathmore University to enhance technology. And there are many other examples of such kinds of initiatives, because if they make those kinds of investments, it is to their advantage, because when these graduates come out, they are tooled with relevant skills that can make them positively contribute to the workforce. So maybe I might want to pause there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And then lastly, Dr. Richardson, are there any examples you can highlight?
Yes, for Ghana, I think what is going on is a lot of training Training. Interestingly, there's limited attention on research training. It's more about capacity building. There's an NGO, local NGO called TTEL, and it's doing a lot in the education space, which needs to be commended. But there again, it's about how are these little pieces coming together. Fortunately for us in Ghana, the government just launched a forum to discuss education in Ghana generally. And I am hoping that there will be opportunity for input into educational research in Ghana and what ought to be done. But be that as it may, I think intervention of ESSA in Ghana and in other places is certainly a stronger push. It gives a stronger push towards connecting what is happening in Ghana to other things happening elsewhere in the sub-region. And I think it ought to be commended. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Yes, I know both ESSA, but also with our colleagues at Southern Hemisphere, it has been a real privilege to see what has been happening across the continent and to make those connections where we can. And that's something we want to continue doing as well. So I think that was my time up, although I would ask all three panelists to stay alert, and myself, I'm going to invite Dana in as well. But I believe, Krista, you're going to moderate the Q&A session for us now.
That's right. Thank you very much, Lucy, for moderating that panel discussion. It was lovely. It was a wonderful discussion. So many valuable insights and contributions. And we've had a few questions coming in now, and I will invite participants to continue to send in any questions into the Q&A chat, or you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask it verbally. You can share your thoughts on the interventions that were shared by Dana, and then you can ask a question as well. So just really quickly, I'll start with the questions that we've gotten in the chat so far. Like Lucy said, she and Dana will be answering the questions, but there will be some that have also been thrown to the panelists. So if you could just please be on standby. The first question is by Abdishakir Tara. And the question is, as vast continents with high level of diversity in education advancement, are there best practices in areas of education research, including policy, ethics, and funding? So I can throw this to Lucy and Dana to answer.
Lucy, do you want to give it a go? I'm not sure I can answer that one.
I'm not sure I can answer it either. So it's the question, are there best practices
Yes,
across this diverse continent? So I want to say, yes, there are centres of best practice that we have come across in our research. I don't think in such a diverse continent you could have one source of truth for what that looks like. But there are organisations, APHRC is one. I think also there was a conference last year held in Ghana at University of Cape Coast, ESSA, and I'll have to remind myself what that acronym stands for, but that was attempting to bring education researchers together from across the continent to absolutely discuss these things. So I would say, no, there's not one source of truth on this, but there are centres where those conversations are happening. And if you look at our situation analysis, and I'll ask maybe Krista or Ellie to put the link to our situation analysis that we published as part of the EERA project, that highlights where some of those conversations are happening. But I wouldn't say it's at the stage where, yes, there's absolutely an objective, this is how we do things. That's not something I've seen, but if others have seen that, please do come in or write it in the chat.
I think one of the things we do, if you read the concept notes, is we try to show what are very promising practices and things that should be supported that are showing promise. within the education sector, but also lessons that one could draw on from other sectors in Africa, like I think Lucy mentioned Carter, which is supporting this kind of capacity strengthening in the health sector. So how can we draw on examples of best practices that are happening in other sectors in Africa? And there's certainly a lot happening. There's a research shed initiative, for example, supported by the National Research Foundation in South Africa. Kenya has a National Research Foundation, which is, you know, a best practice or a good practice in terms of national research funding. But whether they include focus on education research, not enough, or if any at all. So that's really what we want to push. There's a lot of good work happening, but not necessarily in education.
Thank you. Do any of the panelists want to address that before we move on to the next question?
I think just adding to the contributions, that is why this conversation is very important. I think best practices are happening in some locales, but how do the other people in the other parts of the continent get to know about this? And so the opportunity to cross-fertilize ideas and learn from each other is very important. And that is why these interventions are, to me, the way to go. So that we wouldn't be asking this question if we were all connected and we knew what was happening elsewhere.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson.
Krista, could I just say one more thing? And it's just to add to the conversation from the panelists, our colleagues here. Also thinking about, because Africa is very diverse, and the countries are at different levels of research development, and also that is to a large extent influenced by their budgets. And Amy even touched on that when she talked about funding of research. So different countries are at different levels, and so because of that, you'll find that's why when we talk about defining best practices, how do they look like? Because they are going to be different for different countries. But then, as Dr. Richardson has said, these interventions that are being launched today are really important because then they provide a framework within which each country can borrow from and contextualize within what their resources, within the resources that they have and what their national interests are. But at the end of the day, also remember that the countries to remember that we have to talk about the African agenda, and the AU Agenda 2063 is really a guiding light for us as Africa. So for the one of the participants who asked, well, what is the African agenda? Really, those kinds of directives or initiatives really guide who we are as Africa, as the continent, and where we want to go. But then there are some countries, of course, we can commend their efforts, or maybe we can kind of learn from. We know South Africa, their National Research Council is very strong in terms of supporting their researchers. We see Nigeria also doing a lot. Ghana also publishes quite a bit. Kenya is also trying to be there, and we know Tanzania as well. Rwanda also have really been pulling up in terms of improving their research capacities. So yes, we are making progress, and we need to keep on having these kinds of platforms and getting stakeholders together so we can continue to strengthen our research and development ecosystem in Africa. Thank you. Back to you, Krista.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So our next question is from Samson Yekple, and he's saying the colleges of education in Ghana are a great green ground to champion the education research in Ghana and beyond because of the current focus of the status of the academic staff. Will you consider building partnerships for mentorship and support and coaching in achieving the aim of the EERA project? So this is largely to Lucy and Dana again.
Lena, would you like me to?
Yeah, please go ahead. Sorry, I was
that.
responding to a question in the chat.
Yes,
Sorry.
I saw that. No. So, well, I'll give a very short answer, which is I think colleges of education are absolutely critical players in this. And they're at this kind of magic point where they are both researchers and implementers at the same time. There is no need for the research to go through a whole policy process before it can start affecting the practice and understanding of teachers, particularly pre-service teachers. But I'd love to hear from Dr. Richardson, who is really embedded in that ecosystem, and how you might see the role of education colleges in this, in strengthening that broader field of education research.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you're spot on. I think very critical. The situation in Ghana, and for which I think the question came, is that for a long time, the colleges of education are focused on preparing the practitioners. The research part of it had been very low. It was more like practice. Now there's a kind of a status change for the people who work there to be focused on research. So I think the question was asking whether there will be some kind of support for them to be able to up their research skills and be able to support educational research. And I think it's yes. I don't think these interventions are peculiar to just the traditional universities. They are going to be implemented in educational institutions that are into educational research. And so it will be a good idea that colleges of education begin to position themselves, that when opportunities come for training, opportunities come for establishment of research chairs, which I'm very interested in, they wouldn't say these are for traditional universities. I want to see colleges of education take over some of these interventions and make it their own, and then that will be a sure way to building their capacity as well and making them contribute to educational research.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Would anybody like to add anything to that before we move on to the next question?
Maybe I can just make a quick contribution to what Dr. Richardson has said in terms of schools of education and placing themselves. When we look at the World Economic Forum report, I think it's 2024, their jobs report, I think it's 2024, they have indicated that education is still going to be the top in terms of those areas that are important for economic development. Then I think there is technology and then others, and we know what AI is doing right now in terms of impacting the job market. So because education is still going to be very critical, given the role of technology and what AI is doing in terms of changing jobs to how we know them, there are certain skills that will be required. And so there'll need to be a lot of retooling and upskilling for the different jobs. So the School of Education is still very important. And so there is really need to build their capacity. And also, Dr. Richardson, what you said, that not only building capacity, but then also thinking about the researchers, because the educators would need to move more into research as well and use that data. And I think Amy also alluded to that earlier on. So much of research is done, it's put in the shelves. So it is, there is need to engage the educators also as action researchers. So then they can be able to impact the learning, impact the knowledge that is gained, which in turn also will have a positive contribution for the job market and preparing the graduates for those jobs of the future, so to speak. Thank you. Back to you, Krista.
Thank you, Dr. Lucy. Absolutely. So the next question is from Amulika Okonjo. And the question is, what role do you think the private sector can and should play in driving African education research agendas? I'll open this. Yeah.
I'll start. Well, I think the private sector has a role to play in a number of areas. Well, one is, actually funding education research. Another is demanding research, so requesting research that will then support, if it's private sector schools, or if it's even private sector manufacturing, there will be needs that they have in terms of education research for their enterprises. So they can play a role in funding, they can play a role in requesting research, and they can also provide places of work for education researchers to explore their research fields and research and development, for example, and various products. So there's private sector that's manufacturing or agriculture that could be supporting, education research from their perspective, but then there's also the private sector education institution that can be supporting research in different ways, using the products of research, for example. Some of my ideas, but I don't know what other people have to add.
Thank you, Dina. Does anybody else want to go?
And funding bursaries, scholarships, research shares.
Well, I would just say I can see the potential, Dina, but I haven't seen a lot of action, and I would be really interested to hear from anyone who has successfully or either been part of or seen a private sector support of education research. I see it in other areas outside education. So yeah, maybe Dina, if you can give a concrete example, that would really bring it to life.
We've got Zimi who's joining us here right now, and she's the one asking difficult questions about what is African education research. And Zimi's position, so we're a private sector firm, and her position is partly funded by the Xenex Foundation, our job is to basically to work with Zimi and her mid-career research as she works to develop her over the next 3 to 4 years to become a mid-career researcher focused particularly on evaluation of education research. And they are funding these positions, co-funding. We're co-funding and they're co-funding these positions.
Fantastic.
But they are a foundation created by the private sector, not directly private sector. That's a bit different. Maybe.
Yeah. And I think that is one of the struggles so I have seen corporate partnerships to much more tangible education ventures, like, where you can see schools and you can see the children there. And I think it is a big challenge to the research community. How can we make investing in research as exciting, as tangible, as compelling a partnership?
Absolutely. Emis, your hand was up. Did you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that as far as private sector is concerned, what we have seen in our country mostly is partnerships with the development partners, especially in that area of research. Currently, we have even formed a technical working group with education.org to synthesize evidence in Kenya, which can be used by policymakers to inform on various policies, review policies, and decision making. So for private sector per se, we have not seen. But what I can propose is we can bring them on board. Let us all co-create, let us work together, because it will benefit the whole nation, specific countries, for the good of education. Yeah, because if a private sector undertakes a research and it keeps themselves, it does not make sense. It does not help the nation. And we cannot embrace it because at times as government, we may not feel it's authentic. But when we are involved in the process And we have seen how the process has taken place, the various steps undertaken. This involvement makes the government embrace the findings from those researches. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, and we have 3 participants who have their hands raised. So I'll just mention you by name so you can just ask your questions. The first one is Bisala Salah. And apologies if I don't pronounce your name correctly. But Bisala Salah, please speak now.
Yeah, sorry, please, there was an error, please.
Okay, no problem.
Please, we are fully participating and following up. Thank you.
Thank you. The next person is Ibiabuchi Glory. Hi, Ibiabuchi, can you hear us? Okay, maybe that was also a mistake. I do have some more questions that people sent into the chat, so let me just quickly go through them. This is from Zimingona Bakade Sigenu, and he or she is asking, how do you define African, or how can we begin to define what is an African-led agenda? I'm asking because in such platforms with these discussions, one of the struggles is deciding on priorities because of the diverse contexts and priorities of the different African countries.
That's a great question, and I'm also going to just kickstart the response. So when we were talking about this and using these words, this came as a directive from the Forum for African Education Researchers. So this should be an African-based, African-led, African agenda. And in our understanding, and this is open to interpretation, and I think each group may want to define it for themselves, but it's basically researchers who are working and located in Africa, research stakeholders who are living, working, and located in Africa, supported possibly by the African diaspora in various ways. Is one of the things that our steering committee was talking about as well, but led by people who are working on the continent in education research. And that may be contentious in itself.
Thank you, Tina. Does anybody
and Mo,
have...
maybe in Mo's closing remarks, she might have some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah. Any other additions to that before we move on? Quite conscious of the time now.
I think really very quickly to add to what Dana has shared, and also one of I think in a couple of the interventions, the conversation around when you think of African-led, oftentimes, or what has historically been there, is that there is support from the global north. So now there is this push, and this is what the interventions are recommending, is that there's a gradual shift, because we can't just cut the cord because there's a lot of interconnectedness, but then gradually empowering African researchers and African institutions to have a more Africa-grown, African-looking research that is developed or is coming out or emerging from Africa itself. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. I think that's an intervention that's very important if you want to talk about African-led, African-grown research. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just pose one more question, which is to the panelists, and then if you could all just answer like in 10, 15 seconds. This is from Sophia D'Angelo, and she's asking that she'd love to know your perceptions, that's the panelists' perceptions on non-academic research. How can we elevate and value non-academic research published by African researchers and institutes, while still encouraging and supporting African researchers to publish in academic peer-reviewed journals? And in your opinions, can we simultaneously support both of these things? I know I said I was giving you just a few seconds, but that is a lot. But yes, if you could answer as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Anyone want to respond?
Okay, maybe
Richardson?
I can start. Yeah, good. I think non-academic research is as valuable as any other form of research. For me, a lot of times some agenda can be picked up from there for the academic research. I know where the person is coming from, because often the idea is to downplay the non-academic research and then highlight academic research, but I don't think that ought to be the case. I think there should be that kind of relationship where non-academic research influences academic research as far as education is concerned. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Richardson. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, what I can say very quickly is that I think what we have seen over time is the onslaught on knowledge and what really is knowledge that is acceptable. So whether it's academic or non-academic, we need to think about what criteria are we using to make sure that whatever information is being shared is credible information, regardless of whether it's academic or non-academic. And oftentimes, those of us who are in academia are accused of sitting up there in utopia, and the information is not able to reach the actual people that information is supposed to reach and impact. So we really need to harmonize these two seemingly opposite poles. And Dr. Richardson has said that they indeed, even non-academic research is important. So basically think about what is the level of rigor, whether you are doing academic or non-academic research, and whichever research that is, how does it actually reach the people that it is supposed to reach and impact? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Emmy, do you want to go really, really quickly?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I just want to say, even an academic research can be credible if the due process has been followed to get that information. So it can also be applicable. But I just want to mention this, as far as advocacy is concerned, we need to utilize research these avenues for or forums for education to deliberately spearhead research and talk about research in Africa. Let's use available forums. For example, I'll give an example of Kenya. We normally have various education forums, but in those forums, we have never had any research findings being disseminated to those people. It's the high time we started that approach. Can we utilize what we have in our countries to disseminate findings from researches that has been carried out in Africa? Even what we are doing now, let people know how we are going about to have the African agenda to undertake research in Africa, which can inform policy and decision makings, so that everybody comes to know what is happening in Africa.
Thank you very much. Thank you again to our panel. Thank you to Dina and Lucy as well for answering the questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't go through all the questions, but we will address them after this webinar and share the responses with you. I'll hand over now to Dr. Modupe Adefeso Olateju from the Brookings Institution to give the closing remarks. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much. I think this has been such an interesting, engaging, and absolutely, enlightening, set of conversations. My name is Mola Teji. I'm a fellow of Brookings Institution, founder of the Education Partnership Center in Nigeria. But I think most importantly for today, a member of the steering committee of this very important ERA project. And since July, I've joined with other African scholars and experts, Moses Ngware, Mwenda Taragui, Ndaye Ndaye, and Knox Muchunu, to collaborate with ESSA and with Southern Hemisphere in our pursuit to identify the priorities that Dena has so brilliantly presented today, to discuss them, to refine them, and to finalize them into the 8 interventions that have been the focus, of our conversations today. I think you'll all agree, with me that the panel discussion was truly engaging and enlightening. I want to say thank you to Lucy Wakiagi, to Dr. Richardson Adayim Kunum, and to Emis Ejeru. Now, what did I take away, from the discussions, that we had on the panel? And obviously the question and answer as well, threw up very interesting insights and I think some direction for us as we go forward. I think for me, there's a centrality to the importance of democratizing access to knowledge. And may I add, democratizing access to African epistemologies and ways in which Africans know. And so we talked about the ecosystem needing to function properly. So it's important for us to focus as academic researchers on the production of evidence, but to also think about policymakers, for example, as key ecosystem actors in collaborating and seeing how we can encourage governments to dedicate budgets to education research. There was also something very important about starting with the researcher. And so synthesizing the research agenda to avoid duplication was an important construct for us in this conversation. We talked about collaboration, networks of researchers, beginning from the local research agenda, synthesizing upward into national agenda, and then into sub-regional and quite possibly regional agenda. And I quite appreciate that bottom-up approach to how it is that we think about the construction, of research agenda. I think a theme that also struck me was that of inclusion and taking an inclusive approach to education research, beginning with gender equality right from the very beginning, thinking about not just girls, but also boys, thinking about disability, thinking about how we use technology to drive inclusion. I think a lot of hope also comes from the work that's been shared, that's happening at country level already. And I do note that there was a nod in the direction of South Africa and Nigeria as it pertains to government's prioritization of the funding of academic research. And we hope that we will continue to see this more and more. Of course, we also talked about, private sector funding when we got to the question and answer, and why it's important for the private sector to see themselves as a key partner in this conversation. There are opportunities for continued and increased funding for research projects, for bursary scholarships, for requesting and commissioning research, for absorbing education researchers via employment opportunities. So as I close my reflections, I can't help but think about the turmoil in the international development space, which many of us belong to, that has occurred in the last few weeks. And I can't help but think that this creates a ripple effect for evidence production and practice in Africa. And for me, really brings into sharp focus the need for Africa to set and own its own research agenda and to establish the sort of partnerships that will further these agenda. I don't know that there is a better time for collective action than now. That said, there is an African proverb that if you want to go fast, you go alone, but if you want to go far, you go together. And so I would like, on behalf of the entirety, of ESSA and Southern Hemisphere and all of the advisors who've supported us, in this steering committee, to say thank you to colleagues at Jacobs Foundation, Kidney Given, Imaginable Futures. I do believe Sam Muchaga is here for supporting this project. A huge thank you to the teams at ESSA and Southern Hemisphere, Lucy Eisel, Dana, Kathy, Brilliant Latte. Thank you for all your wonderful work. And of course, to all of you who are here participating in this important conversation, for lending your thoughts, lending your insights to the design of the next phase of the project. I'm now going to hand it over to Eisel for final comments before we close the day. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Mo. Really grateful for those closing remarks. And before we all leave, we have survey. We just want to really request for your input to help us improve future sessions. So Ni, if you can quickly post the survey. Yeah, so feel free to leave once you've filled the survey. Many thanks. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone. Much appreciation. So we'll just take some minutes for people to fill the survey and you can leave at your pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Great conversation.